They're a happily married couple, building a future for their family.
They were hardworking. You always see them out there in the field.
In many ways, I think they felt like they were living the dream, just to live in a green, peaceful, idyllic place.
But their lives would be destroyed by a vicious crime.
This was a savage crime scene. There was blood everywhere.
This had been a very violent encounter.
As the investigation unfolds, a bizarre tale of lust and desperation comes to light.
It was really sexually driven behavior that they would exhibit out in public.
She had gone into a trance, and she was directing him to kill.
And at the heart of it all is a terrifying secret that will leave both the family and community awash in tragedy.
Love can push you to do strange things, but to drive it to the point you're committing murders is a whole different level.
Dallas, Oregon is the kind of quaint, close-knit community where everyone knows each other.
It's really sort of a Norman Rockwell kind of community.
Very picturesque little town out in the country. It looks like a postcard.
Two of the area's most well-known residents were David and Marilyn Jondle. The couple owned and ran the Abundant Life Farm on the outskirts of town.
Everybody in the neighborhood knew them. They'd do anything for you. They're the most loving, caring people. The Jondles had three boys, Wayne, Luke, and Andrew. They adopted them as children from different parts of the United States as they moved around. The Jondles raised the boys as their own, and they gave them everything, all of their time and commitment and love.
The family had opened the farm when they moved to the area in 2000. It was a change in career for David, who had spent 25 years as a successful software engineer in Silicon Valley.
Mr. Jondle's success in California had given them a significant nest egg where they were fairly secure.
They wanted something different, to live the rural life, the farm life.
It had been his dream to come to Oregon to start an organic farm.
On our road, the Jondles had the only working farm. They grew organically, raised cattle, they raised chickens.
The farm was called Abundant Life Farms. They're very devout Christians, and so abundant life is one of those things that you get from biblical teachings.
Determined to build a promising future for their boys, the Jondles practiced hard work and self-reliance in every aspect of their lives.
Mrs. Jondle is homeschooling the boys, and the homeschool would include things like farming classes.
The Jondles were hardworking. You always see them out there in the fields and dealing with their livestock.
It was a family operation, not just David and Marilyn, but their children had been involved in operations there at the farm. It was a group team effort.
They just seemed to be a good family raising their kids out in the country on a farm.
As the years passed, David and Marilyn's sons began to fly the coop one by one. Their oldest son, Wayne, enlisted in the military when he turned 18. A few years later, the middle son, Luke, got married and also moved out. Only the youngest son, Andrew, seemed interested in following in his parents' footsteps.
Andrew was more shy and a bit coddled by his parents, and he stayed there on the farm and worked there. It certainly appeared that David Jondle had built this very cool farm, this sort of mini country empire, to pass on to the younger son, Andrew.
Andrew seemed the natural choice since he was the only one who was interested in doing that work.
In the fall of 2009, Andrew began dating a woman in town, and had begun to make plans to build his own family there on the farm, leaving Marilyn and David confident that all their hard work would be rewarding for generations to come.
In many ways, I think they felt like they were living the dream. Just to live in a green, peaceful, idyllic place and to be able to have an operation like they ultimately made.
But the Jondle's idyllic dream would soon turn into a nightmare. On the morning of August 31st, 2010, the Polk County 911 dispatch receives an alarming call from the Abundant Life farm.
The person calling was a man who was delivering water to the farm, and he had come across an unconscious person.
He found the body of an adult male, and he was in the garage, and blood around him. I arrived on the scene. Deputy Everts was already on the scene, and he was having the complainant that had called in walk down the hill, down the driveway to him.
Water delivery guy tells the deputy that he got there to drop off bottles of water, which he does every week, and he looks into the garage and sees a body lying there with its head caved in. He's not sure that it's even real. That's how gory the scene is.
When we got up to the house, the garage door was almost all the way open.
I could see an older white male. His forehead's completely depressed. There's a hole in his forehead, blood all around him.
It was immediately apparent to me that his injuries were grave and that he was deceased.
An apparent murder weapon was laying nearby. It was a scythe, a large farming implement used for cutting wheat.
He had been stabbed with it. It had just been placed there.
Police identified the victim as 61-year-old David Jondle.
His body was seated, slumped against the garage wall, like a haunted house at Halloween. It was just very disturbing.
Once police found David dead there in the garage, they obviously began a search for Marilyn. They cordoned off the scene and began a search of the property. They made their way to the garage.
There was a kitchen in that immediate vicinity, and the linoleum floor was covered in blood, deep in blood. As I further went into the house, we were able to see the body of Marilyn Jondle.
She had blood all around her, and she was laying face down and had a big laceration on her head.
It's clear to authorities that Marilyn has been dead for some time. Police also know that the Jondle's youngest son, Andrew, still lives at home with his parents, but there's no sign of him anywhere inside the house.
And the question immediately is, where's Andrew?
Is he the victim too?
Coming up, police take a closer look at the crime scene.
There had been a violent ransacking of the house.
And evidence surfaces that the crime may have been more personal than authorities originally suspected.
There was a lot of anger and resentment in this relationship.
In Dallas, Oregon, beloved local farmers David and Marilyn Jondle have been found murdered on their property.
David Jondle was found in the garage. Like David, Marilyn had also been savagely attacked, and it appeared they had been the victims of the same killer.
This was a big case for Polk County Sheriff's Office. Murders are not real common, and to have two people killed in the same incident was even more rare.
Authorities work quickly to clear the property, cautious that the killer might still be nearby.
Police make sure that the assailant wasn't still there, and also to look for anybody else who might be connected to the crime.
The search turns up no signs of the perpetrator, nor does it reveal any signs of the Jondle's youngest son, Andrew, who still lives at home and who police fear could be a victim as well. The search does, however, uncover an ominous piece of evidence.
One of the detectives that went down to the barn in order to go through that and check it for evidence, and that's where they found the pipe.
They found a pipe covered in blood, and they're pretty confident that whoever committed the murder threw it away when they fled the scene.
Police examine the crime scene for more clues. They begin inside the garage with the body of David Jondle.
What really struck me about the scene was the vicious nature of the attack on Mr. Jondle.
The coroner determines that the killer had assaulted David Jondle with 2 different murder weapons, both the scythe found next to David's body and the bloody pipe that had been found in the barn.
There were the stab wounds to his chest and that from the side. His cause of death, though, was considered blunt trauma from the head.
The front of Mr. Jondle's head had been so badly beaten that it was literally caved in, and there were pieces missing.
I didn't see anything that looked like defensive wounds. It looked to me like David was surprised and may have never even known that he was being attacked.
Based on the victim's clothing and where his body is found, detectives can theorize how the attack might have unfolded.
David was wearing a robe and slippers, clearly preparing to go to bed.
It appeared from the physical evidence that Ms. Jondle could hear a disturbance out in the garage. She had gone to the door to find out what had happened, had opened the door, and when she did, then the killer came for her. She evidently tried to keep the door shut. The killer entered into the house and killed her by using a pipe and beating her to death with it.
I pictured somebody going from the garage into the house while swinging this pipe and hitting the door. And for me, that kind of brought this scene to life.
Detectives also notice obvious signs of disarray throughout the Jondle's home.
The entire house had been ransacked. Drawers were open, stuff was thrown around the house. Jewelry from Mrs. Jondle's jewelry box was missing. Mr. Jondle's wallet was missing credit cards out of it. Miss Jondle's purse had been gone through.
The Jondles were reasonably affluent. It's possible that a person casing the area may have thought that they were rich enough that they could have been a good target.
Maybe this is a burglary or something, and they came home and interrupted them, and that's how they got killed.
The robbery theory begins to seem less likely, however, when detectives take note of several valuables left in plain sight.
There were no signs of forced entry. Didn't appear to be a break-in. The garage was open, which indicated that David had opened it to go through it out to the driveway to meet someone.
You start narrowing down, well, maybe it's somebody they know versus just a stranger.
The theory that David and Marilyn knew their killer is bolstered when detectives consider the excessive overkill on display in both murders.
If you look at the body of Mr. Jondle, you can see with the caved-in head and the amount of force and all that was used, and then the stabbing afterwards, there's a lot of anger that goes into something like that. There's a lot of rage. You don't accidentally do that. You don't accidentally cave somebody's head in.
Detectives speak with neighbors to see if they saw anything suspicious in the days leading up to the murders.
A neighbor had seen the Jondles the day before out working on their farm, but they hadn't heard any commotion since then.
2 policemen, they were questioning me, had I heard anything the day of the tragedy, and of course I hadn't.
It is a farm area, and there's probably at least an acre of distance between their house and any other residents out there. I would not expect that a neighbor would have been able to hear yelling or any kind of violence.
Neighbors also confirm that the Jondles' youngest son, Andrew, still lives at home. But no one can recall seeing him for several days. Beyond that, the neighbors don't know much about the family.
As far as the neighbors knew, everything in the family was fine, and David had been successful in Silicon Valley and had just moved up to Oregon to start a farm. They didn't know anything about what his life was actually like down in California. So in a case like this, law enforcement's going to look as far back into someone's past as it makes sense to. Did he have enemies in Silicon Valley? Did he move to Oregon to escape something down there?
Could these murders have been the result of something that David had done earlier in his life?
But as detectives dig deeper into Marilyn and David's personal life, they are unable to uncover evidence of anyone that held a grudge against the couple.
We did victimology on both of the victims, but everyone we talked to said they had no enemies, they had no debt. There was nobody that would have a motive to want to harm them.
As news of the crime spreads, the community is left reeling from the heinous double murder.
There was a lot of shock. It's just a small rural community. How come this is happening?
People naturally worry that maybe this was a random slaying and that there might be a killer still on the loose out there.
The local community was initially in fear. They heard that 2 people were killed and there wasn't information about who had done it.
Hoping to track down Andrew Jondle, police visit the local church where his family had been active.
They were very devout to their faith, and I think that fellow church members were probably the biggest part of their social support system.
Police meet with the church's pastor, who offers up new information about the Jondle family.
He said, I need to give you some information about their son, Andrew Jondle.
Andrew had had a huge fight with his parents, and he'd gone to see his pastor about it.
He had come to the pastor and asked for money because he had run away from home, and it's just completely out of character for him and that whole family.
The relationship between Andrew and his parents had gotten so bad that they weren't talking to each other, which was surprising. This had been a really close-knit family up to that point. So police are trying to figure out what caused this rift between Andrew and his parents. And was it so bad that it would lead to their murder?
Coming up, police work quickly to track down Andrew Jondle. But what they learn will redirect their entire investigation.
She liked to have control of the situations that she was in. She could control him.
After his parents are found brutally murdered on their farm in rural Oregon, police are searching for 20-year-old Andrew Jondle.
We were made aware initially when talking to some of the friends and family of the deceased that there was some tension between their younger son and the family.
We learned that there had been some family strife involving the Jondles' youngest son, Andrew. And I think all of our ears perked up and we really began wondering, well, what's going on here really?
Police learned that Andrew had abruptly moved off the family farm just a few weeks before the murders. But no one knows where he is now.
We were tasked with locating Andrew, and so we used a computer system.
His name had come up on a Salem police report in conjunction with a woman named Cindy Lou Beck.
Detectives learned that Cindy is 46, has 2 teenagers, is single, and struggling to hold down a job.
She's on probation for a theft.
That caused her to lose custody of her kids. She was living in an apartment in Salem, about 20 miles from the farm. She was often confrontational with her neighbors. Police had gotten involved several times.
An officer had gone out and dealt with her and a neighbor having some sort of argument or disturbance. And in that report, that Salem officer had listed Andrew as being Cindy's boyfriend.
Police discover that she's in a relationship with Andrew, which is odd because there's such a wide age gap between the two of them. Andrew's 20, Cindy is 46.
To learn more about Cindy Beck and her relationship to Andrew Jondle, detectives contact her neighbors at her apartment complex.
We were all just sitting out there having a cup of coffee, and all of a sudden we get swarmed by all these detectives. One of the detectives starts asking us questions about what we knew about Andrew and Cindy Lou Beck.
The neighbors confirmed that Andrew and Cindy were indeed in a romantic relationship. The couple had first met the previous fall.
She and her kids were at a park, and she saw Andrew talking to one of her kids. They connected and exchanged information. Cindy didn't seem to be bothered by the age difference. She just saw something different in Andrew.
Neighbors said that he was over at her apartment all the time.
When we noticed that Andrew first started coming around the apartment complex, I made the assumption that he was friends with her son, just based on his age. And then you would see Andrew and Cindy Lou together, and it became clear pretty quick that he wasn't friends with her son at all, that they were together.
They really seemed like they liked each other a lot. It seemed like there was a huge physical attraction between the two.
But what had attracted Andrew to a woman more than twice his age?
Cindy's this kind of down on her luck, middle-aged woman, and Andrew's this young 20-year-old kid. Their relationship just didn't make a lot of sense.
Cindy's neighbors believed that she had given her younger lover the adult attention he seemed to have been yearning for.
Andrew had grown up pretty sheltered. Half of his life on this farm in the middle of nowhere in a pretty close-knit environment. Didn't have a lot of exposure to the outside world, and along comes Cindy, who maybe makes him feel like a man.
They were very lovey to each other, a lot of public displays of affection.
It was a constant, really sexually driven behavior that they would exhibit out in public.
She had a vibe of almost somebody who was very domineering. So I think that she liked to have control of the situations that she was in. And I think having a younger boyfriend was probably a big part of that control. She could control him.
Detectives learned that Andrew had recently decided to introduce Cindy to his parents. But Marilyn and David hadn't reacted the way Andrew had hoped.
Andrew finally decides to introduce his girlfriend to his parents, and they are immediately concerned. There's the age difference, which just doesn't make a lot of sense to them. And then there's just a kind of a culture between the two of them that worries his parents. Cindy's very domineering. Andrew is subservient and submissive and quiet in her presence and just unnerving to his parents.
David and Marilyn Jondle did not approve. This began to disrupt the relationship that Andrew Jondle had with his parents.
They told Andrew they wanted him to stop seeing this woman. He just refused.
Cindy's neighbors tell police that the fight between Andrew and his parents over his relationship with Cindy is what ultimately led him to take one of his father's trucks and move off the family farm.
And he took the truck and he ran away from home and moved in with Cindy.
Despite the fact that Andrew was a legal adult, Marilyn and David had told their son they couldn't sit back and watch as he threw away his future for a woman like Cindy Beck.
Andrew's father had threatened to cut ties with him if he didn't move out and stop seeing Cindy.
They had tried to get Andrew to come back home because he was living with this older woman, and being a religious family, they were completely against that out of wedlock. And so it was a major issue for them at that point in their lives.
The fight between Andrew and his parents had further intensified when David and Marilyn had asked the court to intervene on their behalf.
The Jondles requested, and it was court-ordered, that the pickup that Andrew was driving be returned to them.
Andrew had complied with the court order and returned the truck to his parents, but he'd refused to end his relationship with Cindy. Then, not long before the murders, David Jondle had made one last attempt to convince his youngest son to return home.
The neighbor had said that Andrew's father had come to their apartment to talk with them, and she estimated they talked for about an hour.
David and Marilyn just want the best for their son. They want him to be happy, they love him, and they don't think this relationship is it, that it's good for him. They don't think Cindy is a good influence on him, that it's healthy for her to be in his life. David goes to try to talk some sense into his son and see if he can convince him to move back to the farm. Andrew refuses, and police figure out that that conversation happened a week before the murder. So that's pretty significant.
Neighbors also reveal that late on the evening before his parents' bodies were found, Andrew had been seen roaming the complex and acting strangely.
The night before, we were all sitting out having a beer. It was pretty late at night. Probably 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, Andrew walks by. He doesn't say a word to us. He doesn't look at us, nothing. And we don't do anything either. And then he went and sat on the step of his patio.
The neighbors claimed that Andrew had seemed extremely nervous that night and was shaking as he sat on his patio, which led the neighbors to believe something was going on. Detectives decide it's finally time to talk to Andrew and Cindy in person and knock on the front door of Cindy's apartment.
It took several knocks to get an answer, and the male had answered the door. It was identified as Andrew pretty quickly, and we asked if we could come in. We entered the apartment. It had appeared that they were sleeping, and Cindy had asked the question of what's the investigation, and the other detective said, well, we'll tell you more when we get to the sheriff's office. Andrew went to get dressed in the back bedroom, and I, of course, followed him to that back bedroom, and he actually went to put on some type of bracelet, and his wrist was shaking uncontrollably when he's trying to put that bracelet on. And I remember just this, shiver kind of coming over me just looking at that, because he hadn't asked any questions about, what's going on, what's this investigation, but obviously he is extremely nervous and something's going on.
Detectives' suspicions are further piqued when a pair of items catches their eye in the apartment's living room.
We saw 2 credit cards on a small table, and we were able to clearly see that they were in the names of David and Marilyn Jondle, which further led to them as being suspects.
Cindy and Andrew were both arrested.
They're hauling both of them out. The detectives said they were going to be questioned under the suspicion of murder. We were all blown away.
Coming up, Andrew Jondle tells police what happened between him and his parents.
They call Andrew in for questioning, and at first he denies it.
But police discover a glaring discrepancy in his story.
I told him, stop. This is not right. You need to take responsibility for your own actions. And that's when the story came out.
Detectives have taken 20-year-old Andrew Jondle and his 46-year-old girlfriend, Cindy Lou Beck, into custody on suspicion that the couple might be involved in the double murder of Andrew's parents.
We had taken them down to our patrol vehicle and patted them down to make sure that neither had any weapons. And then the entire drive from Salem to the sheriff's office was complete silence.
Back at their apartment complex, neighbors share their impressions of the strange couple with the gathering news media.
He had a look in his eye, and I always called it shark eyes, because there was no emotion behind his eyes. When he looked at you, it wasn't happy, it wasn't sad, it wasn't mad, it wasn't anything. It was just blank, empty stare.
Usually he's in a chippery mood. He doesn't say things that are normal. He's a really weird guy.
Once at the sheriff's office, Cindy and Andrew are placed in different rooms and interviewed separately.
My job was just to talk to Cindy and get the history of the last 24 to 48 hours from her and just let her talk.
Cindy denies knowing anything about the murders of Andrew's parents, but she does admit that she didn't get along with the Jondles.
Cindy and I talked about Andrew's parents, and one of her statements to me was that she knew that they hated her. And she didn't really provide a whole lot of information beyond that. Cindy never got angry, cried, showed any real emotion. There was no real substantive information that she was providing during that interview.
Andrew's interview, however, is much more eye-opening.
They call Andrew in for questioning, and at first he denies it, but pretty weakly, and detectives kind of lead him to the idea that they know what happened, there's plenty of evidence, he needs to just tell them the truth, and he responds to that almost right away and confesses to the murders.
He straight up said that he killed his father, but his motive behind why he did it was self-defense.
Andrew explains that he and Cindy had fallen on hard times in recent weeks and had become desperate for cash.
Andrew and Cindy Lou were probably being evicted from their apartment based on the fact that Cindy hadn't paid in a couple months and they weren't working.
Andrew had asked his brother for money to pay the rent, and he was so against what was going on that he refused to give him the money. The pastor of the church who we met, he said that Andrew had come to him asking him to pay the rent, and he told him, church isn't going to do that. We don't agree with what you're doing, living with an older woman. The pastor offered to let him live at his house, and Andrew refused that offer.
With his options running low, Andrew had finally swallowed his pride and contacted his father for help. On the evening of August 30th, Andrew says he traveled to his parents' farm.
He tells police that he took a scooter from Cindy's apartment to his parents' house because he didn't have a truck anymore because his parents took that away from him.
Andrew says his father had met him outside the house, but their discussion had quickly turned south.
He said he had gone and asked for money, and then his father attacked him.
But police have a hard time believing David Jondle would ever physically assault his son.
And this is after we've gotten story after story after story from the community. Everybody that they know say that they're the most loving, caring people, that they raise these boys as their own. They've given them everything, all of their time and commitment and love. And here's their son saying, I had to defend myself because my dad attacked me. His story, honestly, didn't make any sense at all. If you self-defense kill your father, why'd you kill your mom? I told him, stop. You're gonna take your father and disrespect his memory by coming up with some story about how he's a violent person that attacks you. And I know that's not true, and you know it's not true too. And I said, you need to start over and you need to tell the truth. And that's when the story came out.
Through tears, Andrew admits that while he had gone to his parents' house for money, he had always planned to take it forcefully.
The plan was to kill them both while they were sleeping. He actually waited outside the residence a couple hours.
As he's sitting there watching them, the lights stay on, they're moving around in the house, and he needs to figure out another way to kill them.
Finally, Andrew Jondle called his parents. David Jondle answered the phone. Andrew said that he was out on the highway and that he wanted his dad to come and pick him up, and that he wanted to talk things over and try to make peace. But in reality, he was right on their property watching them.
David Jondle tells him, yes, of course I'll help you. I'll come right down. He hangs up his phone and goes to the garage to get his truck. What he doesn't know is that Andrew is standing outside that door.
David Jondle was opening the garage door and was blindsided.
Andrew attacked his father and beat him with the pipe, and he said that his father fell and was laying there.
Andrew tells police that he hears his father gurgling and wants to pick up the scythe to put him out of his misery or show mercy, but he's been stabbed several times, so that story doesn't really add up.
Andrew says he just killed his father when his mother entered the garage.
Marilyn Jondle came to the garage to investigate what the disturbance was.
Her son is standing over her husband's dead body with a scythe. Andrew drops the weapon, picks up this bloody lead pipe, and goes after his mom.
He said she turned around and ran, and from the crime scene, he tried to hit her as he was going into the house. He didn't hold back.
In the way that he described the attack, it was clear that they had to have seen that he was their killer.
Andrew tells detectives that once both of his parents were dead, he ransacked the home.
He went through the house, strewed everything around to make it look like a burglary, stole the money, credit cards, and jewelry, and then got back on his scooter and headed back home.
When he left the scene, he had the things that he had stolen. He had blood all over his shirt and went over 20 miles from the farm into Salem.
How he didn't get stopped by any local law enforcement is beyond me, because he took a bunch of the back roads. So he would have potentially gone through several different law enforcement jurisdictions.
Following his confession, Andrew Jondle is charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Police also take Cindy into custody for her role in helping to cover up the crime.
She spontaneously commented, you know, it was in self-defense. I just simply told her that she was under arrest for hindering prosecution and lodged her in the jail.
Police, however, are convinced Cindy Lou Beck is more involved in the murders than either she or Andrew will admit.
It didn't make any sense that this quiet, passive kid just snapped and butchered his parents without any other influence. You have to wonder what or who could push him to the point where he was willing to kill his parents in cold blood.
The more detectives learn about this relationship, they understand that Cindy is this very dominant figure in Andrew's life, and it starts to make increasing sense that he wouldn't have done this without her telling him to. The problem is Andrew has just confessed to the crime without any indication that Cindy put him up to it. So you have to wonder, have they decided that he's gonna take the fall for the whole thing?
Coming up, as prosecutors prepare for trial, a new discovery suggests an even more startling motive behind the double murders.
She had gone into a trance and was directing him to kill his parents.
In Polk County, Oregon, Andrew Jondle and his girlfriend Cindy Lou Beck are in custody for the murder of Andrew's parents.
The police have Andrew's confession, but at this point, Cindy's only been charged with hindering prosecution, and they think that she's more involved than either of the two of them have admitted.
She had admitted that she had helped Andrew get rid of the clothes he was wearing at the time of the murders. I think she had said that they had thrown them away.
Her response during the interview was that she never had an active role in it. She stayed in the apartment. She never left. Andrew was the one that did this.
Police believe that Cindy isn't taking full responsibility for her role in the murders, so they turn back to Andrew Jondle. When they inform Andrew that Cindy has put the blame solely on him, he decides to come clean.
We later learned she had actually helped plan the homicide.
In further talking to Andrew Jondle, detectives are able to put together a very, very complex motive. He admits the crime wasn't really about money as he first told them. It was about getting back at his parents for trying to break up the relationship between him and Cindy. And, as it happens, Cindy had pushed him into murdering his parents.
Andrew Jondle saw his parents as a threat or a detriment to this relationship. I think that there may have been more of a feeling that I am an adult now and I do not want my parents to be controlling my life.
It played into Cindy's hands when Andrew's father told him that he was going to cut him off if he didn't end the relationship. He took away the vehicle, and she was able to continue to tell him how bad his parents were.
He's infatuated with her, and she's letting him live with them, and so he probably owes her, kind of in his mind.
Cindy's not doing well. She's lost custody of her kids. She has no job. She's facing eviction. And this plan feels like a way out.
Cindy Beck could see that the Jondles lived in comfort and that there was probably some money there.
The plan was that Andrew was going to kill his parents. He was going to get money and jewelry so that she could pay the rent. Andrew would inherit the farm and they could move out to the farm and live there.
Andrew also reveals the bizarre manner in which Cindy had ultimately convinced him to go along with her plan to kill his parents.
Andrew claimed that Cindy had convinced him she was clairvoyant and could see the future, and that what Andrew needed to do in order to be happy was to murder his parents.
Cindy Beck posed to Andrew as a psychic or a spiritualist. She would act as if she had gone into a trance and she was directing him to kill his parents in order to be able to successfully be on his own and to live life as he wanted. He did believe what she was saying and the interpretation that she made of why it was being said.
He was being manipulated by a far older woman who had a different agenda than he might have by himself. The level of involvement of Cindy Lou was pretty astounding and pretty atrocious. It was extremely evil.
With Andrew's second statement implicating Cindy in hand, prosecutors upgrade her charges to 2 counts of murder. Prosecutors also offer Andrew Jondle a plea deal.
Andrew made a deal with the DA's office to avoid the death penalty. He pled guilty to 2 counts of aggravated murder and 1 count of burglary. He agreed in that plea agreement to testify against Cindy.
When Cindy learns of Andrew's plans to testify at her trial, her defense team approaches the prosecution with an offer.
Cindy pled no contest to 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder.
Cindy Beck got 20 years.
Andrew ended up receiving a lifetime sentence with the possibility of parole after 50 years.
At the actual sentencing, he did show remorse, and I believe it was genuine.
Love can push you to do strange things, but to drive it to the point you're committing murders, and those being of your parents, is a whole different level.
It was not something that a child is supposed to do to their parents. It's unfortunate that they couldn't have both got help sooner and prevented the loss of life.
The surviving Jondle brothers still find in their heart the ability to forgive and excuse Andrew's behavior to a certain degree. The human capacity to forgive is really quite amazing to me.
Berlin is a city that has witnessed nearly every chapter of modern European history. It is a place where old scars exist beside cutting-edge technology, where centuries-old buildings stand across the street from some of the most advanced medical institutions in the world. Every day, thousands of doctors, nurses, and caregivers move through its hospitals, clinics, and private residences. Their work is often invisible to the public. They care for the sick, comfort the elderly, and stand beside families during some of the most difficult moments of their lives. Among those medical professionals are specialists in palliative care. For many people, the term itself is unfamiliar. Yet palliative medicine represents one of the most deeply human areas of healthcare. It is not focused on curing disease. Instead, it focuses on easing suffering. Doctors working in this field help patients manage pain, discomfort, and fear. They support people living with serious illnesses and, in some cases, accompany them through the final stages of life. To enter a patient's home as a palliative care physician is to be granted an extraordinary level of trust. Families open their doors. Patients share their fears. Medical decisions are discussed openly. Personal vulnerabilities become visible. The relationship between doctor and patient becomes something more than clinical. It becomes personal. And because of that trust, few professions carry greater responsibility. Now imagine, for a moment, that the person entering those homes was not there solely to help. Imagine that the individual entrusted with relieving suffering was accused of causing it. Imagine learning that the last reassuring face some patients saw before their deaths belonged to the very person later accused of killing them. That is the disturbing allegation at the center of one of Germany's most shocking modern medical crime cases. The accused is a Berlin palliative care physician identified publicly only as Johannes M. in accordance with German privacy laws. According to prosecutors, between September 2021 and July 2024, he exploited the unique trust placed in him as a doctor. Under the guise of providing medical care, he allegedly administered drugs to vulnerable patients that caused them to stop breathing and die. The allegations are staggering. At least 15 patients, ages ranging from 25 to 94, men and women, individuals already facing serious health challenges, people who relied on medical professionals to protect them, people whose families believed they were receiving compassionate care. Yet what makes this case particularly chilling is that for years, almost nobody suspected anything. At first glance, the deaths appeared explainable. After all, these are patients with severe illnesses. Some required extensive medical treatment. Some needed regular home visits. Some lived with conditions that naturally carried a risk of death. When one of them passed away, grieving relatives mourned a loss that seemed tragically understandable. There was sadness. There was heartbreak. But there was rarely suspicion. Why would there be? Death, unfortunately, is a familiar presence within palliative medicine. Doctors working in this field are often present near the end of a patient's life. Families know this. Medical staff know this. Society knows this. As a result, individual deaths can blend into a larger pattern of expected outcomes. A patient dies. Paperwork is completed. Loved ones begin grieving. Life moves forward. But eventually, something began to stand out. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Not in a way that immediately triggered alarms. Instead, the concerns emerged gradually, almost quietly, hidden among countless routine medical interactions. A death here. Another death there. A coincidence. Then another coincidence. And another. The same physician's name seemed to appear repeatedly. At first, such a pattern might not seem unusual. Doctors who care for seriously ill patients inevitably experience patient deaths. That reality alone proves nothing. Yet over time, some observations became more difficult to dismiss. Certain patients died shortly after being visited by Johannes M. Still, even that might not have been enough to trigger a major criminal investigation. But then another element entered the picture. Fire. Not one fire. Several. Investigators would later focus on multiple incidents in which patients died and fires subsequently broke out at their residences. At first glance, these incidents appeared unrelated. Perhaps they were accidents. Perhaps they were unfortunate coincidences. Perhaps they had innocent explanations. Yet when viewed together, they began to form a disturbing pattern. A patient dies. A fire occurs. Another patient dies. Another fire follows. Again and again, investigators would later find themselves asking the same question. Was this really random? Or was someone attempting to erase evidence? At the time, however, nobody possessed the full picture. Families certainly did not. Many continued grieving under the belief that natural illness had claimed their loved ones. The wider public remained unaware. Even within the healthcare system, concerns had not yet crystallized into formal accusations. Meanwhile, according to prosecutors, the alleged crimes continued. Months passed, then years. Behind apartment doors across Berlin, patients received visits from a doctor whose professional duty was to alleviate pain and preserve dignity. The prosecution would later argue that some of those visits had a very different purpose. One of the most unsettling aspects of this case is the setting in which it allegedly unfolded. There were no dramatic kidnappings, no masked intruders, no violent confrontations in public spaces. The alleged crimes took place in environments associated with care and compassion. Living rooms, bedrooms, private residences, places where vulnerable people felt safest. Places where medical professionals were welcomed without hesitation. Places where trust itself became a crucial factor. That trust, according to prosecutors, provided cover. A doctor carries authority. Patients often follow medical instructions without question. Family members frequently assume that treatments are legitimate. Complex medications can be difficult for non-medical people to understand. And when a seriously ill person dies, many naturally attribute the death to the illness itself. In hindsight, investigators would argue that these factors may have helped conceal what was allegedly happening. But hindsight only exists after the truth begins to emerge. At the time, there was no obvious villain, no clear crime scene, no single event that immediately exposed everything. Instead, there were fragments, deaths, records, timelines, small irregularities, pieces of information that meant little on their own but would eventually become part of a much larger picture. And as authorities began examining that picture more closely, the scope of the allegations expanded. What initially appeared to involve only a handful of suspicious deaths grew into something far larger. Investigators would eventually review hundreds of cases connected to Johannes M.'s work. Special teams would be assembled. Medical records would be scrutinized. Bodies would be exhumed. Questions that once seemed unthinkable would become unavoidable. How many deaths were truly natural? How many were not? And how could such allegations remain hidden for so long? The answers to those questions would send shockwaves through Germany's healthcare system. They would leave families searching for explanations. They would force medical professionals to confront uncomfortable realities about trust, oversight, and vulnerability. Most importantly, they would place the lives of at least 15 patients at the center of a criminal case unlike almost any other. Because according to prosecutors, these individuals did not simply die while receiving medical care. They were killed by the person entrusted to help them. Today, Johannes M. faces allegations that have transformed him from a respected physician into the central figure in one of Germany's most controversial criminal proceedings. He has been accused of becoming something no doctor should ever become: a predator hiding behind a white coat, a man allegedly operating within one of society's most trusted professions, a physician who, prosecutors argue, crossed the line between caring for the dying and deciding who should die. But before investigators reached those conclusions, before arrests were made, before courtrooms filled with grieving relatives and journalists, there were patients, there were families, there was trust, and there was a system built on the assumption that those entrusted with caring for the vulnerable would honor that responsibility. The story of how that trust allegedly unraveled begins not with the accused, but with the world in which he worked, a world where compassion, medicine, and human vulnerability intersect every single day. And it is there that our story truly begins. To understand why the allegations against Johannes M. shocked Germany so deeply, it is necessary to understand the environment in which he worked. This was not a battlefield, a prison, or a place where violence would be expected. It was the world of palliative care, one of the most sensitive and trust-dependent fields in modern medicine. It is a world built around a simple principle: when a cure is no longer possible, compassion remains. For patients facing serious illness, palliative care is often a lifeline. It does not promise recovery. It promises comfort. It seeks to reduce pain, ease anxiety, and preserve dignity. The physicians who work in this specialty are often invited into the most private corners of a person's life. Unlike doctors who primarily see patients in hospitals or clinics, palliative care professionals frequently visit patients in their homes. They sit beside beds. They speak with family members. They become familiar faces during periods of fear and uncertainty. Over time, They may become some of the most trusted people in a patient's life. Families depend on their guidance. Patients rely on their expertise. Medical decisions that can affect comfort, quality of life, and treatment are often placed in their hands. Because of this, palliative medicine operates on a foundation of trust unlike almost any other area of healthcare. That foundation is what makes the allegations in this case so disturbing. According to prosecutors, Johannesem allegedly used the authority and access granted by his profession to commit crimes against the very people he was expected to protect. But before examining those allegations, it is important to remember the individuals at the center of the story. Discussions about criminal investigations often focus on suspects, evidence, and court proceedings. Yet behind every statistic is a human life. In this case, prosecutors identified at least 15 alleged victims in their indictment. They ranged in age from 25 to 94 years old. 12 were women. 3 were men. Most lived in Berlin. Many were receiving medical care in their own homes. Their names have not been widely publicized, and many personal details remain private. Nevertheless, certain facts reveal the diversity of the people involved. The youngest alleged victim was only 25 years old. The oldest was 94. Between those ages existed an entire spectrum of lives, experiences, relationships, and personal histories. Some had likely spent decades building families, careers, and communities. Others still had years they expected to live. Some may have faced difficult medical diagnoses. Others may have been adjusting to chronic conditions that required long-term support. What united them was vulnerability. They were individuals who depended upon medical care. They relied upon healthcare professionals for treatment, guidance, and reassurance. Most importantly, they trusted the system that was designed to protect them. Prosecutors later emphasized a crucial detail that would shape the entire case. Many of these patients were seriously ill, but they were not necessarily on the verge of death. This distinction is essential. Palliative care is often associated in the public imagination with end-of-life treatment. While many palliative patients do have life-limiting illnesses, receiving palliative care does not automatically mean death is imminent. Some individuals live for months. Others live for years. They continue relationships, celebrate birthdays, spend time with loved ones, and participate in everyday life while receiving support for pain management and symptom control. According to prosecutors, several of the alleged victims fell into this category. They were not expected to die immediately. Their conditions were serious, but death was not considered imminent. This allegation transformed the nature of the case. If true, investigators argued, these were not deaths caused by disease progression. They were not medical complications. They were not lawful end-of-life decisions. Instead, prosecutors classified them as murders. That distinction would become one of the central themes of the case. The victims' illnesses initially helped conceal what investigators later alleged had occurred. When a seriously ill person dies, family members often prepare themselves emotionally for that possibility. Doctors understand that such deaths are unfortunately part of medical reality. Healthcare systems process countless cases involving patients with severe conditions. Against that backdrop, an individual death may not automatically appear suspicious. This is particularly true when the deceased person already had significant health problems. A declining condition may seem expected. A sudden medical crisis may appear plausible. The line between natural deterioration and something more sinister can be difficult to recognize. Prosecutors later argued that this reality created an environment in which alleged crimes could remain hidden. But at the time, families were focused on caring for loved ones rather than searching for signs of criminal activity. Imagine the perspective of a family member caring for a seriously ill relative. Daily life often revolves around medication schedules, doctor visits, symptom management, and emotional support. Every day can present new challenges. Every improvement brings hope. Every setback brings concern. In those circumstances, trust in healthcare professionals becomes essential. Family members often lack the medical expertise necessary to independently evaluate every treatment decision. They rely on physicians to act ethically and competently. When a doctor arrives at the home, that trust is rarely questioned. The physician represents knowledge, experience, and authority. For many families, a doctor's presence brings reassurance. In the case of Johannes M., prosecutors allege that this trust played a critical role. Colleagues reportedly viewed him positively. Witness testimony later described him as polite, professional, and dedicated. He was not known publicly as a controversial figure. There were no widely reported accusations against him during the period covered by the indictment. According to accounts presented during legal proceedings, he was generally regarded as a competent physician. This image would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. The allegations did not emerge against someone already viewed as dangerous or unstable. They emerged against a doctor who appeared to fit the expectations of a caring medical professional. The contrast between appearance and accusation would leave many observers struggling to reconcile. Two radically different images of the same person. On one side stood the physician described by colleagues as courteous and well-liked. On the other stood the man prosecutors accused of intentionally ending patients' lives. Such contradictions often appear in major criminal cases. The public searches for warning signs. Friends and co-workers revisit old memories. People ask whether clues were missed. Yet at the time these events allegedly occurred, those around Johannes M. largely saw a doctor performing his duties within a respected branch of medicine. Between September 2021 and July 2024, that professional role provided him access to patients throughout Berlin. Home visits formed a significant part of the work. Unlike a hospital environment, where multiple staff members may observe patient interactions, home care often places physicians in more private settings. Visits may occur in bedrooms, living rooms, or apartments where only the patient and doctor are present. Such circumstances require an extraordinary degree of trust. The patient cannot independently verify every medication. Family members may not always be in the room. Medical expertise remains concentrated in the hands of the physician. Prosecutors later argued that Johannes M. exploited precisely these circumstances. Yet during the period in question, the families involved had little reason to suspect wrongdoing. They saw a doctor arriving to provide care. They saw someone trained to reduce suffering. They saw a medical professional performing duties that appeared entirely routine. It is important to remember that none of the alleged victims could know they would later become part of a major criminal investigation. Their final interactions with healthcare providers likely seemed ordinary. They expected treatment. They expected guidance. They expected care. The same can be said of their loved ones. Family members opened their doors believing they were welcoming help into their homes. They trusted that medical decisions would be made according to ethical standards. They believed that the healthcare system functioned as intended. For years, nothing publicly suggested otherwise. Yet according to prosecutors, a pattern was already developing behind the scenes. Deaths occurred. Records accumulated. Visits were documented. Timelines quietly formed. At first, each event existed in isolation. One patient dies, then another, then another. In a profession where death is an unfortunate reality, individual cases rarely reveal a broader picture. Only later, when investigators began examining those cases collectively, would they identify connections that raised alarming questions. The victims themselves never had the opportunity to tell their stories. The allegations against Johannes M. would emerge only after many of them were gone. As investigators reconstructed events, the focus shifted toward understanding what happened during those final visits and why so many deaths appeared linked to the same physician. The answers prosecutors eventually proposed would transform a respected medical professional into the central figure of a murder case that shocked the nation. But before those allegations became public, before police launched a major investigation, and before prosecutors filed murder charges, there existed only a trusted doctor, vulnerable patients, and a healthcare system built upon confidence in those entrusted with caring for the sick. It was within that world of trust and vulnerability that the events at the center of this case allegedly unfolded. And according to investigators, the next chapter would reveal how ordinary medical visits became the foundation of one of Germany's most disturbing criminal prosecutions in recent memory. According to prosecutors, the events that would eventually form the foundation of the case against Johannes M. unfolded over a period of nearly 3 years. Between September 2021 and July 2024, what appeared on the surface to be routine medical care allegedly concealed a series of crimes committed against some of Berlin's most vulnerable patients. To understand why investigators later described the allegations as so disturbing, it is important to remember how ordinary these encounters initially appeared. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public acts of violence, no obvious signs that would immediately attract police attention. Instead, the alleged crimes took place within the familiar routines of medical care. A doctor arrived for a scheduled visit. A patient received treatment. Family members assumed professional standards were being followed. Everything appeared normal. Yet according to prosecutors, behind those ordinary interactions existed a very different reality. At the center of the allegations was a method investigators believe was designed to exploit both medical knowledge and the vulnerabilities of seriously ill patients. Prosecutors alleged that Johannes M. administered a combination of medications that included a powerful anesthetic or sedative followed by a muscle relaxant. According to the indictment, these drugs were given without medical justification and without the patient's consent. To understand the significance of this allegation, it is necessary to examine the effects of those medications. The first drug allegedly rendered the patient unconscious or heavily sedated. In that condition, the individual would be unable to meaningfully resist or seek help. The second drug, according to investigators, was even more critical. Muscle relaxants affect the body's muscles, including those responsible for breathing. If administered improperly and without respiratory support, they can paralyze the muscles necessary for life. Prosecutors argued that the combination caused patients to stop breathing and die within minutes. What makes this allegation especially chilling is the environment in which it allegedly occurred. These were not emergency rooms crowded with medical staff. Many of the patients were being treated at home. Home visits are a common feature of palliative medicine. Physicians travel to patients who may struggle to leave their residences because of illness, disability, or advanced age. Such visits often take place in quiet, private settings. A doctor may enter an apartment carrying medical supplies. Family members may briefly leave the room. Some patients may be alone when treatment is administered. The trust required for such care is immense. Patients rarely question every medication provided by their physician. Family members generally assume that treatment decisions are medically appropriate. According to prosecutors, that trust created the conditions in which the alleged crimes could occur without immediate detection. Investigators later argued that many of the deaths appeared natural precisely because the victims were already dealing with serious medical conditions. A patient suffering from chronic illness may experience sudden complications. Breathing difficulties can occur for many reasons. Unexpected deterioration is unfortunately not uncommon among individuals with significant health challenges. Because of this, a death may not automatically trigger suspicions of homicide. Prosecutors later contended that this reality worked in Johannes M.'s favor. If a patient died shortly after receiving care, family members and healthcare providers could reasonably assume that the underlying illness was responsible. The allegations suggest that this assumption may have helped conceal what investigators believed was occurring. One of the most striking aspects of the prosecution's case is the claim that some visits were allegedly planned in advance with the intention of ending a patient's life. According to prosecutors, there were instances in which Johannes M. allegedly arrived at a patient's residence already intending to commit murder under the appearance of providing medical treatment. Such allegations transformed the case from one involving questionable medical decisions into accusations of deliberate and premeditated homicide. Yet for months and then years, no public scandal emerged. No immediate criminal charges followed. The deaths remained isolated events scattered across Berlin. Families mourned. Medical records were completed. Life continued. It is impossible to know what many relatives were thinking during those moments. Some may have believed their loved one had finally lost a difficult battle against illness. Others may have struggled with grief while finding comfort in the belief that professional care had been provided. The possibility that a trusted physician might have intentionally caused death was not something most families would naturally consider. This is one reason the case later generated such widespread public shock. The allegations challenged fundamental assumptions about trust in medicine. As prosecutors reconstructed the timeline, another disturbing pattern began to emerge. Deaths alone had not immediately attracted attention. But according to investigators, several deaths were followed by something highly unusual: fires. These incidents would become one of the most important components of the entire case. Prosecutors alleged that Johannes M. intentionally set fires at multiple locations after patients had already died. At least 5 such incidents became a focus of the investigation. According to authorities, the purpose of these fires was not random destruction. Investigators believed they were intended to conceal evidence. Prosecutors argued that the fires could have served several purposes. They might destroy medication packaging. They might eliminate traces that could point investigators toward the use of specific drugs. They might obscure physical evidence. They might complicate efforts to determine the exact circumstances surrounding a death. Most importantly, they could help create an alternative explanation for what had happened. If investigators viewed a scene primarily as a fire-related incident, attention might shift away from the possibility of homicide. Whether viewed individually or collectively, the alleged fires introduced an entirely new dimension to the case. A suspicious death can sometimes be overlooked. A suspicious death accompanied by a fire is far more difficult to ignore. Yet even then, the full pattern remained hidden for some time. One of the most significant incidents reportedly occurred in 2024. According to investigators, Johannes M. visited an elderly female patient. After the visit, a fire broke out. This time, however, events did not unfold as prosecutors believe he intended. The blaze failed to spread in the manner expected. Emergency responders arrived before extensive destruction could occur. The outcome would prove crucial. Instead of eliminating evidence, the incident attracted attention. Questions emerged. Certain details appeared unusual. While no single event immediately solved the case, investigators later described this failed attempt to conceal evidence as one of the turning points that helped expose the larger pattern. Looking back, the significance of that moment becomes clearer. Criminal investigations often begin not with a dramatic breakthrough, but with a small irregularity. A detail that does not fit, a timeline that raises questions, an event that refuses to align with expected explanations. In this case, authorities would eventually identify multiple such irregularities. At the time, however, those concerns remained fragmented. A fire in one location, a death elsewhere, medical records connected to another patient. No single piece of information told the entire story. Gradually, though, the collection of incidents became more difficult to dismiss. Investigators would later discover that the same physician appeared repeatedly at the center of numerous cases. What initially looked like isolated tragedies began to resemble something else entirely. As prosecutors reconstructed events, they focused on the period from September 2021 through July 2024. Within that time frame, they alleged that Johannes M. repeatedly exploited his position as a palliative care doctor. Each case added another layer to the investigation. Each death raised additional questions. Each connection strengthened suspicions. Yet the alleged victims themselves remained at the heart of the story. They were not merely entries in medical files or names in an indictment. They were individuals whose final days were shaped by serious illness and dependence on medical care. They sought treatment from a healthcare system designed to provide comfort and protection. According to prosecutors, some of them instead encountered a physician who abused that trust in the most extreme way imaginable. The alleged crimes were remarkable not because of visible violence, but because of their apparent invisibility. Investigators would later argue that the method relied upon secrecy, medical authority, and assumptions surrounding natural death. The setting itself became part of the alleged concealment. A seriously ill patient dies. Such an event is tragic, but not necessarily suspicious. A physician was present. Medical treatment was provided. The death appears explainable. Case closed. At least, that is how it may have appeared initially. What nobody yet realized was that beneath these individual tragedies, a much larger pattern was allegedly developing. One that would eventually attract the attention of colleagues, investigators, forensic experts, prosecutors, and ultimately the German public. By the time authorities began connecting the dots, the number of suspicious cases had already grown significantly. The alleged crimes had spanned years. Families had buried loved ones. Medical records had accumulated. Potential evidence had faded. Yet despite those obstacles, questions continued to surface. Why were so many deaths connected to the same physician? Why were fires appearing after some of those deaths? Were these truly unfortunate coincidences or signs of something far more sinister? Those questions would soon trigger an investigation that expanded far beyond a handful of suspicious cases. What began as isolated concerns would evolve into one of the largest and most alarming medical homicide investigations Germany had seen in recent years. And as detectives started examining the evidence more closely, they would discover that the story was even bigger than they had initially imagined. Most major criminal investigations begin with a moment, a body discovered in suspicious circumstances, a witness who comes forward, a piece of evidence that immediately points investigators toward crime. The case against Johannes M. unfolded differently. There was no single dramatic revelation, no obvious crime scene, no confession, no eyewitness stepping forward to describe a murder. Instead, the investigation emerged slowly from a collection of observations that, on their own, might never have attracted significant attention. A patient died, then another, then another. Each death appeared understandable when viewed individually. The victims were seriously ill. Some required extensive medical care. Some received regular home visits from healthcare professionals. Death, while tragic, was not unexpected in many cases. Yet eventually, certain people within the healthcare system began noticing patterns that were difficult to ignore. One of the most important figures in the investigation was not a detective, forensic expert, or prosecutor. It was a senior female healthcare manager who had worked with Johannes M. According to testimony later presented in court, she had once viewed him as a dedicated physician. He was regarded as polite, professional, reliable. Colleagues generally considered him a competent member of the medical team. Nothing about his public reputation immediately suggested criminal behavior. Yet over time, concerns began to emerge. The concerns were not based on a single event. Instead, they developed through repeated observations. According to information later presented by investigators, an unusually high number of patient deaths appeared connected to Johannes M. More troublingly, some of those deaths occurred shortly after he had visited patients. Even then, such observations alone were not enough to prove wrongdoing. Palliative care physicians regularly treat people with severe illnesses. High mortality rates are unfortunately part of the profession. However, another detail complicated the picture. Several deaths were associated with fires. The recurrence of both deaths and fires created a pattern that became increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The healthcare manager reportedly found these developments troubling. The more she observed, the more questions arose. Why did these events seem to cluster around the same physician? Why were fires appearing repeatedly in situations involving recently deceased patients? Why did the patterns seem to continue over time? Eventually, she made a decision that would alter the course of the entire case. She reported her concerns to authorities. Looking back, this moment represented one of the most significant turning points in the investigation. Many criminal cases remain unsolved because warning signs are overlooked or dismissed. Here, concerns were communicated before they could disappear into the background of routine medical practice. What began as professional unease would soon become a major criminal inquiry. Once investigators became involved, their initial focus remained relatively narrow. Authorities did not begin by examining hundreds of deaths. They started with only a small number of suspicious cases. Early reports indicate that investigators initially focused on 4 deaths that appeared unusual, enough to warrant closer scrutiny. At this stage, the inquiry remained limited. Detectives still faced a fundamental problem. Suspicion is not evidence. Patterns may raise questions, but criminal charges require proof. Investigators needed to determine whether the deaths reflected unfortunate coincidence or criminal conduct. To answer that question, they began reconstructing events in extraordinary detail. Medical records became one of the first crucial sources of information. Investigators collected documentation related to patient care, treatment histories, and physician visits. Every record represented a piece of a much larger puzzle. By itself, a medical chart might reveal little. Combined with dozens of other records, however, it could help establish timelines and identify connections. Authorities also examined work schedules. This step proved critical. Investigators needed to know exactly when Johannes M. had visited specific patients. They compared those schedules against the timing of deaths. This process allowed detectives to identify whether suspicious deaths consistently followed his visits. The work was painstaking. Every appointment required verification. Every timeline needed confirmation. Investigators could not rely on assumptions. They needed facts. As they assembled those facts, the pattern reportedly became more difficult to ignore. Yet even detailed records could not answer every question. Detectives therefore expanded their efforts. Phone data became another important component of the investigation. By analyzing communications and location-related information, authorities sought to verify movements and establish precise timelines. This evidence helped investigators determine where individuals had been and when key events occurred. Again, no single piece of evidence solved the case. Rather, the investigation progressed through the accumulation of many separate findings. Medical records, schedules, timelines, phone data. Each source contributed another layer of understanding. As the inquiry deepened, investigators confronted one of the most difficult and sensitive aspects of the case. They sought permission to exhume bodies. Exhumation is a serious step in any criminal investigation. Families who believe they had already laid loved ones to rest must suddenly confront the possibility that the original understanding of a death was incomplete. Such decisions are never made lightly. Yet investigators believed further forensic examination was necessary. If the allegations were true, critical evidence might still be present. Bodies that had previously been assumed to belong to victims of natural causes now became potential homicide victims. Forensic specialists began conducting detailed examinations. Their objective was simple in theory, but challenging in practice. Determine whether the available evidence supported the hypothesis that drugs had been used to cause death. Time presented a significant obstacle. Some deaths had occurred months or even years earlier. Evidence naturally degrades. Memories fade. Physical traces become more difficult to detect. Nevertheless, prosecutors later stated that forensic findings were consistent with the theory that certain victims had been administered drugs in a manner supporting the homicide allegations. These findings strengthened investigators' confidence that the deaths required criminal scrutiny. The effect on the investigation was immediate. What began as 4 suspicious deaths expanded. Additional cases were reviewed. More records were examined. More timelines were reconstructed. Gradually, the suspected victim count increased. First, there were 4 cases. Then investigators identified 8. Later, 10. Eventually, prosecutors announced murder charges involving 15 victims. Each increase represented another family receiving devastating news. A death once believed to be natural now fell under suspicion. A final chapter that had seemed settled suddenly reopened. Questions that relatives never expected to ask became unavoidable. What really happened? Was the death caused by illness or by something else? Could warning signs have been missed? The growing number of suspected victims transformed the investigation from a localized inquiry into one of Germany's most significant medical crime cases in recent memory. Authorities responded by establishing a specialized investigative team dedicated to reviewing the evidence. The scale of the review expanded dramatically. Investigators were no longer focused solely on the deaths named in the indictment. They began examining a much broader universe of cases connected to Johannes M.'s work. Nearly 400 deaths eventually came under review. The sheer size of that number illustrates the challenge investigators faced. Reviewing hundreds of medical cases requires extraordinary resources. Every file must be examined individually. Timelines must be compared. Medical histories must be analyzed. Potential evidence must be evaluated carefully. The process can take months or even years. Authorities publicly acknowledged that dozens of additional cases remained under consideration. At various points, prosecutors indicated that roughly 70 to 95 further deaths were being reviewed for possible connections. This does not mean those cases were proven crimes. Rather, investigators believe they warranted closer examination. The possibility that the final victim count could exceed the number listed in the indictment added another layer of public concern. For families whose loved ones had been treated by Johannes M., uncertainty became unavoidable. Some wondered whether deaths previously attributed to illness might someday become part of the investigation. Others waited anxiously for updates from authorities. Meanwhile, investigators continued gathering evidence, aware that every new discovery carried potentially enormous consequences. The cumulative effect of the evidence eventually convinced authorities that stronger action was necessary. The inquiry had progressed far beyond preliminary suspicion. Investigators believed they had identified a pattern supported by forensic findings, medical records, scheduling data, and reconstructed timelines. What had begun with concerns raised by a healthcare manager had evolved into a major criminal case. The allegations now extended across multiple years and numerous victims. As the evidence accumulated, authorities prepared for the next stage of the process. The investigation was no longer simply about determining whether suspicious circumstances existed. It had become a question of criminal accountability. Detectives and prosecutors believed they had gathered enough information to confront the man at the center of the allegations. For Johannes M., the years of quiet routine were about to end. For families seeking answers, a new phase was about to begin. And for Germany, the case was about to move from a confidential investigation into a public legal battle that would attract national attention and raise profound questions about trust, medicine, and the vulnerability of those who depend upon care. By the summer of 2024, the investigation that had begun with a handful of suspicious deaths had grown into something far larger. For months, investigators had been collecting records, reconstructing timelines, analyzing forensic findings, and reviewing cases connected to Johannes M. What had once existed only as private concerns inside a healthcare organization was now the focus of an increasingly serious criminal inquiry. Authorities believed they had uncovered evidence pointing toward a pattern of deliberate killings, concealed behind the routine practice of palliative medicine. The next step would bring the case into public view. In August 2024, Johannes M. was arrested. For many people who knew him only as a physician, the news was shocking. The image presented by prosecutors stood in stark contrast to the reputation described by colleagues. According to testimony later heard in court, he had been viewed as professional, courteous, and dedicated to his patients. Yet investigators now believed they had sufficient grounds to place him into custody. Following his arrest, Johannes M. was held in pretrial detention while authorities continued expanding their investigation. The arrest marked a turning point not only for prosecutors and police, but also for the families connected to the case. Some relatives who had already spent months or years grieving suddenly found themselves confronted with a new possibility. The deaths of their loved ones were no longer being viewed solely through a medical lens. They were now part of a homicide investigation. Every update from prosecutors carried profound emotional consequences. Each announcement raised new questions about what had truly happened during the final days of those who had trusted the healthcare system for care and support. Yet, even after the arrest, investigators continued their work. Authorities were still reviewing hundreds of cases. The scope of the inquiry had become extraordinary. Detectives and forensic specialists remained focused on determining exactly how many deaths might ultimately be connected to the physician. Meanwhile, prosecutors began preparing formal charges. That process culminated in April 2025. It was then that Berlin prosecutors officially announced one of the most significant developments in the case. Johannes M. was formally charged with 15 counts of murder. The indictment reflected years of investigative work and represented the conclusions prosecutors believed were supported by the evidence. In addition to the murder allegations, prosecutors also linked him to incidents involving fires that they believe had been used to conceal evidence and obstruct discovery of the alleged crimes. The formal filing of charges transformed suspicion into a legal accusation. It did not establish guilt. Under German law, as in other democratic legal systems, a defendant remains presumed innocent until proven guilty in court. Nevertheless, the indictment provided the clearest picture yet of the prosecution's theory. According to prosecutors, Johannes M. had used his position as a palliative care physician to gain access to vulnerable patients and then intentionally cause their deaths through the administration of medications that were neither medically necessary nor authorized by the patients. One aspect of the prosecution's theory attracted particular attention. In many murder cases, investigators identify a clear motive. Financial gain is among the most common. A suspect stands to inherit money, obtain insurance benefits, eliminate debt, or secure some other economic advantage. In this case, however, prosecutors did not allege that Johannes M. was motivated by money. Authorities stated that they had found no evidence that he stole for patients. There were no accusations that he profited from life insurance policies. No significant financial reward appeared connected to the deaths. The absence of an obvious economic motive made the case more difficult for many observers to understand. If money was not the reason, then what was? Prosecutors offered a disturbing answer. According to their argument, Johannesson may have been motivated by a desire to exercise power over life and death. They suggested that the killings reflected a wish to determine who lived and who died. German prosecutors went even further, invoking a concept known in German criminal law as Mordlust, often translated as lust for killing. This allegation carried enormous legal significance. Under German law, the concept is associated with one of the most serious categories of murder. Prosecutors argued that the evidence suggested a motive rooted not in financial benefit, but in the act of killing itself and the sense of control that accompanied it. It was an accusation that immediately attracted public attention because of its implications. If proven, it would place the alleged conduct among the most severe forms of homicide recognized by German law. Yet prosecutors still faced a major challenge. Presenting allegations is one thing. Proving them in court is another. The case would ultimately be tested through the judicial process. In July 2025, the trial began in Berlin. As proceedings opened, public interest was intense. Journalists followed developments closely. Legal experts examined the prosecution's arguments. Healthcare professionals watched carefully, aware that the allegations had already shaken confidence in one of medicine's most trust-dependent specialties. But for many people inside the courtroom, the case was not primarily about legal theories or public policy. It was about loss. Family members of alleged victims attended proceedings seeking answers about the deaths of their loved ones. Some had spent years believing those deaths resulted from natural illness. Others had only recently learned that authorities considered the death suspicious. Now they found themselves sitting in a courtroom, listening to evidence that challenged their understanding of what had happened. The emotional weight of such circumstances is difficult to overstate. A criminal trial often requires families to revisit painful memories. Medical histories are discussed. Final days are examined. Personal tragedies become subjects of public scrutiny. In this case, that process was intensified by the nature of the allegations. The people accused of causing harm were not strangers who had entered victims' lives unexpectedly. According to prosecutors, the alleged perpetrator was someone the victims had trusted, someone invited into homes, someone viewed as a source of care. As testimony began, the court heard from witnesses connected to the healthcare organization where Johannes M. had worked. Among the most significant was the senior female healthcare manager whose concerns had helped trigger the investigation. Her testimony provided insight into how suspicions first emerged. She described a physician who, at least initially, had been viewed positively. According to accounts presented during the proceedings, Johannes M. was regarded as polite, professional, and committed to his work. This testimony highlighted one of the central tensions in the case. The image described by colleagues did not easily align with the allegations presented by prosecutors. Such contradictions are not unusual in major criminal cases. Defendants are often known differently by different people. Colleagues may describe professionalism. Friends may describe kindness. Investigators may present evidence suggesting something entirely different. The courtroom became the place where those competing narratives would be examined. Yet one of the most striking aspects of the proceedings involved the defendant himself. According to reports from the trial, Johannes M. largely remained silent regarding the accusations. He did not provide detailed public explanations addressing the prosecution's claims. For families, journalists, and observers, that silence created additional uncertainty. Criminal trials often feature dramatic moments in which defendants offer explanations, deny allegations, or provide alternative interpretations of events. Here, many questions remained unanswered. Why did prosecutors believe so many deaths were connected to the same physician? How would the defense challenge those conclusions? What explanation, if any, would Johannes M. eventually offer? The lack of direct answers contributed to the sense of mystery surrounding the case. Throughout the proceedings, prosecutors continued presenting their theory of events. They argued that the evidence demonstrated a pattern extending across multiple years. They pointed to medical findings, timelines, and investigative conclusions that they believed supported the murder charges. The defense, meanwhile, retained a right to challenge every aspect of that case. The burden of proof remained with the prosecution. As the trial progressed, the broader significance of the case became increasingly apparent. This was no longer simply a criminal proceeding involving one physician. It had become a test of public confidence in institutions. Healthcare systems depend on trust. Patients must believe that doctors act in their best interests. Families must feel confident that vulnerable relatives are protected. When allegations arise suggesting that a physician abused that trust, the impact extends far beyond the immediate victims. Every development in the courtroom, therefore, carried implications that reached beyond the legal fate of Johannes M. If convicted on all charges, he faced the possibility of life imprisonment under German law. Prosecutors also sought recognition of the particular seriousness of the alleged crimes, a designation that could significantly reduce the possibility of early release. Additionally, a conviction would effectively end any future role in medicine through permanent professional consequences. Yet, as the trial unfolded, one fact remained unchanged. No final verdict had been delivered. The allegations were extensive. The evidence was being examined. Witnesses were testifying. Prosecutors and defense attorneys were presenting their arguments. But the judicial process was still ongoing. Families continued waiting for answers. Investigators continued reviewing additional cases. And the courtroom remained the place where one of Germany's most disturbing medical crime. Allegations would ultimately be tested. As the legal battle continued, another reality became increasingly clear. Whatever verdict the court eventually reached, the consequences of the case had already extended far beyond the fate of a single defendant. The investigation had exposed vulnerabilities within systems built on trust. It had forced families to reconsider painful memories. And it had raised difficult questions that would continue to resonate long after the trial itself concluded. Those broader consequences would become the focus of the final chapter of this story. Long after police investigations end and courtroom proceedings conclude, the consequences of a criminal case continue to ripple outward. The headlines fade. Public attention moves elsewhere. New stories emerge. Yet for the people directly affected, the impact often lasts a lifetime. In the case of Johannes M., the consequences extend far beyond the fate of a single defendant. They reach into the lives of families who lost loved ones, into the healthcare institutions forced to confront difficult questions, and into a broader public conversation about trust, vulnerability, and responsibility. At the center of this story are the victims. In legal documents, they are often represented by numbers. 15 alleged victims, 12 women, 3 men, ages ranging from 25 to 94. Such figures help explain the scale of the case, but they cannot capture the reality of the lives involved. Behind every number was a person, someone with a history, relationships, hopes, fears, and memories. Someone whose absence created a space that could never truly be filled. Some had likely spent decades building families and friendships. Others may have still been looking toward futures they believed remained open to them. Some were parents. Some may have been grandparents. Others may have been sons, daughters, siblings, partners, or close friends. Each death affected far more people than the individual listed in court records. Every loss created circles of grief extending outward through families and communities. What makes this case particularly painful is the role trust played in the allegations. According to prosecutors, the victims were not harmed by strangers forcing their way into homes. They were not targeted by random criminals encountered unexpectedly. Instead, they placed their confidence in a healthcare professional whose role was to help them. For many families, that betrayal may be among the most difficult aspects of the case to process. Trust is not given lightly when serious illness enters a person's life. Families often depend upon physicians during periods of profound uncertainty. Medical knowledge becomes essential. Professional guidance shapes critical decisions. Vulnerable patients rely on caregivers to act in their best interests. The possibility that such trust could be exploited challenges assumptions that many people hold about healthcare itself. Throughout the investigation and subsequent trial, relatives of the alleged victims were forced to confront questions they never expected to ask. When their loved one died, many likely believed they understood why. They may have accepted medical explanations. They may have mourned while finding comfort in the belief that appropriate care had been provided. Then, sometimes months or years later, authorities informed them that investigators suspected something else entirely. Imagine learning that a death you had spent years trying to understand might not have occurred as you believed. Imagine discovering that police were reopening questions you thought had already been answered. Imagine hearing that your loved one's name had become part of a murder investigation. Such revelations do not erase grief. Instead, they often add new layers to it. Shock, confusion, anger, doubt. Families may begin revisiting memories, searching for details that seemed insignificant at the time. Conversations once considered routine suddenly acquire new meaning. Final moments become subjects of painful reflection. In many ways, the investigation forced relatives to relive losses they had already endured. The emotional burden of that process cannot be measured through legal documents or court transcripts. Yet the consequences of the case extend beyond individual families. The allegations also struck at the heart of public confidence in healthcare. Modern medicine depends upon trust. Patients routinely accept treatments they do not fully understand because they believe qualified professionals are acting ethically. Hospitals, clinics, and home care services function because society assumes that healthcare workers follow established standards and place patient welfare above personal interests. When those assumptions are challenged, the effects can be significant. It is important to remember that the overwhelming majority of healthcare professionals dedicate their careers to helping others. Doctors, nurses, and caregivers routinely work under difficult circumstances to relieve suffering and save lives. Cases such as this attract enormous attention precisely because they are so unusual. Yet even rare allegations can have far-reaching consequences. A single case may cause patients to question decisions they would once have accepted without hesitation. Families may become more fearful. Public confidence can be shaken. In the aftermath of the allegations against Johannes M., difficult conversations emerged about oversight, accountability, and patient protection. How can healthcare systems identify warning signs earlier? What mechanisms exist to detect unusual patterns? How should concerns be reported when colleagues observe troubling developments? These questions became especially significant because the case was not initially uncovered through a dramatic forensic breakthrough. Instead, concerns reportedly emerged when a healthcare manager noticed unusual patterns involving patient deaths and fires. Her decision to report those concerns ultimately helped trigger the investigation. This aspect of the story highlights an important reality. Institutions often rely upon individuals who are willing to speak up when something feels wrong. Many major investigations begin because someone notices an inconsistency and chooses not to ignore it. The role of vigilance becomes particularly important in environments where vulnerable people depend upon professional care. Another unresolved issue involves the final scope of the case. At the time of the proceedings described in this story, investigators were still reviewing a large number of additional deaths connected to Johannes M.'s professional activities. Nearly 400 cases had reportedly been examined. Authorities acknowledged that dozens of additional deaths remained under consideration. This ongoing review means that uncertainty continues to surround the investigation. The 15 alleged victims listed in the indictment represent the cases prosecutors believed supported formal murder charges. Yet investigators have repeatedly stated that they cannot rule out the possibility of additional victims. That uncertainty creates another challenge for families and communities. The story is not entirely finished. Questions remain. New information could emerge. Future findings may alter public understanding of the case. For investigators, this reality reinforces the importance of thoroughness. Every potential victim deserves careful consideration. Every case deserves examination based on evidence rather than assumptions. Yet perhaps the most difficult question raised by the case concerns motive. Human beings naturally seek explanations for terrible acts. We want to understand why. In many crimes, the answer is relatively straightforward. Money, revenge, jealousy, personal conflict. In this case, prosecutors explicitly stated that they found no evidence of financial gain. There were no allegations that Johannes M. profited from his patients' deaths. Instead, authorities proposed something more difficult to comprehend: a desire for control over life and death, coupled with what German prosecutors described as Mordlust. Whether that theory is ultimately accepted by the courts is a matter for the legal process. Yet the allegation itself reveals why the case has generated such intense public attention. Crimes motivated by power and control often provoke a unique kind of fear because they appear disconnected from motives most people can easily understand. They challenge assumptions about rational behavior. They force observers to confront uncomfortable questions about human psychology. At the same time, it is important to recognize the limits of what is currently known. Johannes M. has largely remained silent regarding the allegations. The judicial process exists precisely because accusations must be tested against evidence. Courts are responsible for determining what can be proven and what cannot. Until that process reaches its conclusion, some questions may remain unanswered. And perhaps that uncertainty leads us to the deepest lesson of this case. Trust is both essential and fragile. Society depends upon it. Patients trust doctors. Families trust caregivers. Communities trust institutions. Without trust, many of the systems that support daily life become difficult to sustain. Yet trust also creates vulnerability. The more confidence we place in someone, the more damage can occur if that confidence is betrayed. According to prosecutors, that dynamic lies at the heart of this case. The allegations suggest that the very qualities making palliative care possible, compassion, access, authority, and trust, were allegedly exploited in the most devastating way imaginable. Whether viewed through a legal, medical, or human lens, the story ultimately returns to the victims. They entered a healthcare system expecting care. Their families expected protection. Instead, according to the prosecution's case, some encountered a physician who violated the responsibilities of his profession. As this story comes to an end, one image remains particularly haunting. Across Berlin, over a period of years, vulnerable patients opened their doors to a doctor. They saw a medical professional arriving to help. They saw someone entrusted with easing suffering. They saw a figure associated with comfort, treatment, and care. According to prosecutors, for at least 15 people, that trusted visitor would become the last person they saw before their deaths. And it is that tragic possibility, the collapse of trust in a place where trust should have been absolute, that makes the case of Johannes M. one of the most disturbing medical crime investigations. In modern Germany, whatever verdict history ultimately records, the victims, their families, and the questions raised by their deaths will remain the true legacy of this extraordinary and deeply troubling case. In many true crime stories, there comes a moment when everything is resolved. A verdict is delivered. A sentence is imposed. The unanswered questions disappear beneath the weight of legal certainty. The audience closes the final chapter knowing exactly what happened and why. The case of Johannes M. is different. Even after years of investigation, extensive forensic analysis, hundreds of reviewed records, and a highly publicized criminal trial, many questions continue to linger. In some ways, the most unsettling aspect of this case is not what investigators believe they have discovered. It is what may never be fully known. Somewhere in Berlin, families continue to live with uncertainty. Some already know that the deaths of their loved ones became part of a murder indictment. Others may still be waiting for answers as authorities continue reviewing additional cases. Every ongoing investigation carries a difficult reality. Evidence can reveal a great deal, but it cannot always reconstruct every moment with complete certainty. Memories fade. Witnesses remember events differently. Physical evidence deteriorates. The passage of time leaves gaps that no investigation can entirely erase. For the families connected to this case, those gaps can be especially painful. Many spent years believing they understood how their loved ones died. They grieved, attended funerals, and slowly adapted to life without the people they had lost. Then investigators arrived with a different possibility. A possibility that transformed ordinary grief into something far more complicated. When a loved one dies from illness, there is sadness. There may be anger at fate. There may be frustration toward disease. But there is often a sense that events followed a tragic yet understandable course. A criminal investigation changes that. Suddenly, every memory becomes subject to re-examination. Families may find themselves revisiting conversations that took place years earlier. They may wonder whether they overlooked warning signs. They may question assumptions that once seemed obvious. Some may struggle with guilt despite having done nothing wrong. Others may experience renewed anger as they confront the possibility that trust was abused. These emotional consequences often continue long after the legal process ends. The courtroom can determine criminal responsibility, but it cannot restore certainty to families whose understanding of the past has been shattered. This reality highlights one of the central tragedies of the case. The alleged victims were already facing serious health challenges. Their families were already navigating difficult circumstances. The criminal investigation added another layer of suffering to situations that were already deeply painful. Yet the impact of this case extends beyond the individuals directly involved. It has also become a cautionary story about institutions and oversight. Healthcare systems are built upon countless interactions that occur every day without incident. Doctors prescribe medications. Nurses administer treatment. Caregivers assist vulnerable patients. Most of these interactions are guided by professionalism, ethics, and compassion. Society depends upon that fact. If patients could not trust medical professionals, healthcare itself would become impossible. That is why cases involving alleged abuse of medical authority attract such intense attention. They challenge assumptions that people rarely think about until those assumptions are threatened. Most individuals never question whether a physician intends to help them. They do not scrutinize every medical recommendation. They do not investigate the motives of every caregiver. Trust is assumed because trust is necessary. The allegations against Johannes M. force a difficult conversation about what happens when that trust is allegedly violated. They remind us that professional credentials alone cannot eliminate the need for accountability. They demonstrate the importance of reporting concerns, reviewing unusual patterns, and maintaining systems capable of identifying warning signs. One of the most important figures in this entire story was not a police officer or prosecutor. It was a healthcare manager who noticed something unusual and chose to act. Had those concerns been ignored, the investigation might never have begun. That fact carries a lesson extending far beyond this specific case. Institutions often depend upon individuals willing to speak up when something does not seem right. Sometimes the difference between continued harm and intervention is a single person who refuses to dismiss an uncomfortable question. The case also raises broader questions about palliative care itself. For many people, the words palliative medicine now carry an association they never had before. Yet it is important to remember that the allegations against one physician do not define an entire medical specialty. Every day, palliative care professionals around the world provide extraordinary support to patients and families facing some of life's most difficult challenges. They ease pain. They reduce suffering. They offer comfort when cures are no longer possible. Their work remains one of the most compassionate responsibilities in healthcare. In many ways, that is what makes this case so disturbing. The allegations did not emerge from a profession associated with force or coercion. They emerged from a field built upon empathy. According to prosecutors, the very environment designed to provide comfort became the setting for alleged crimes. The contrast is impossible to ignore. As the legal process continues and investigators review additional cases, another question remains unresolved. How large is the story really? Authorities have already examined hundreds of deaths connected to Johannes M.'s professional activities. The 15 alleged victims named in the indictment represent only the cases prosecutors believed supported formal murder charges. Investigators have repeatedly stated that additional reviews remain ongoing. Whether those reviews ultimately lead to further charges is a matter that only future findings can determine. For now, uncertainty remains part of the story. And perhaps that uncertainty explains why the case continues to resonate so strongly with the public. Human beings naturally seek closure. We want clear endings. We want definitive answers. Yet some cases resist neat conclusions. They leave behind unresolved questions and uncomfortable possibilities. They remind us that certainty is not always available. The story of Johannes M. may ultimately be remembered not only for the allegations themselves, but also for the broader issues they exposed. Trust, vulnerability, accountability, the responsibilities carried by those who care for others. These themes extend far beyond any individual courtroom. They touch fundamental aspects of how society functions. Every patient who accepts treatment places trust in a stranger's expertise. Every family that welcomes a healthcare worker into a home makes a decision rooted in confidence. Most of the time, that confidence is justified. The overwhelming majority of medical professionals dedicate themselves to helping others. But cases like this serve as a reminder that trust must coexist with oversight and accountability. As we reach the end of this story, it is worth returning to the people who matter most, the victims. Public attention often focuses on suspects, investigators, and legal arguments. Yet the true significance of any criminal case lies in the lives affected by it. The individuals at the center of this investigation were more than names in court documents. They were people living through difficult medical circumstances. They had families. They had histories. They had futures they expected to continue experiencing. Whether they were 25 or 94, each life represented an entire world of relationships and memories. The investigation sought to determine what happened to them. The courts seek to determine responsibility. History will eventually record the legal outcome. But beyond the headlines, beyond the legal arguments, beyond the forensic evidence, there remains a simple and sobering truth. A profession founded upon care became the setting for allegations of extraordinary harm. Families searching for comfort instead found themselves confronting suspicion. A trusted physician became the subject of one of Germany's most significant medical homicide investigations, and a series of deaths that once appeared unrelated ultimately forced an entire nation to ask how. Such allegations could emerge in a place where trust should have been strongest. That question continues to echo long after the courtroom doors close, and perhaps it always will.